Hi, Courtney, and welcome along to the E-commerce Impact Podcast. It's awesome to have you here.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, me too. I'm really excited to dig into our topic today, a very hot topic at the moment. So, before we get started, I'd love it if you could introduce yourself to our guests and let them know what you've been working on lately and what you're all about.
Yeah, so my name is Courtney Lindau Lee, and I lead the web analytics and BI team at Nimble Gravity. Nimble Gravity is essentially a data focused consultancy. So we have data science, web analytics, we work in e commerce and strategy, as well as global engineering. But the main core of our business is all focused on helping our clients really grow using the power of data. So I started my career at a boutique marketing agency. And then after a couple years there, I went in-house for a large Fortune 150 company, got to go really deep into analytics there, lead the web analytics team. And then I decided I missed working with clients. So that's how I ended up back at Nimble Gravity.
Amazing. Love that. I'm sure that's quite an kind of interesting combo of experience working both agency side and in-house. So you can kind of see it from both sides.
Yes, it's really fun to get kind of both sides of that.
Yeah, exactly. So tell me, what data practices do you think brands should be putting in place at each stage of the e-commerce journey? So let's talk about, what should people be doing at the sort of 0 to 1 million stage of growth, and then 1 to 5 million and 5 to 10 million, and then beyond 10 million. So what do you think brands should have in place at each of those stages?
Yeah, I think with the very first stage, that 0 to 1 million, getting something in place like a GA4 mix panel, Pendo, something so you can at least start monitoring the high level of your analytics, get to know how much traffic you're getting to your website on a regular basis, start familiarizing yourself with how users explore different pages on your site, making sure that if you're reaching out to new business, new partners, things like that, you're actually getting traffic from it. But like you said, it doesn't have to be a super complex tracking setup. Using a free tool is probably the best place to start, just starting to get used to how the marketing dimensions look there. Then as businesses grow to that 1 to 5 million, this is really where I think getting more complex tracking in place is very important. The tracking that you'll put in place will depend on your business and what your business goals are. So if you're e-commerce, of course, you need to measure how much revenue you're driving, what people are buying, how they're getting to your site, and what that full journey looks like on their way from landing all the way through purchase. And you can also start to get some deeper insights into what people are clicking on. Are they engaging with your CTAs? Making sure to start tracking some of that high level engagement as well this is the place where I'd start to get deeper with the tracking. So, 0 to 1 is very basic. The 1 to 5 million, I might start getting a little bit more complex with what you'd track.
So when you say getting more complex and tracking these things, what tools are we talking about here, and what does that actually mean in practice? Is that looking at more data points more often, pulling them into some kind of graphical report? What does that practical work look like for a $1 to 5 million business, ecom
Yeah.
business?
So this will probably be something like a Google Tag Manager to get some of that e-commerce data. You'll probably use Google Tag Manager, as well as for any of your click tracking, you can use that. It's a free tool along with your free Google Analytics. So that's a really effective way to get a lot of data tracked without spending a lot of money.
Mhm.
There's a lot of other tools depending on if you're using a Shopify site. There's a lot of add-ins there that can do a lot of the tracking for you, or something like WordPress. You might use a WooCommerce for your e-commerce tracking. So a lot of those tools also have that built in. So seek out those built-in tools if you're using something like a Shopify, because there's a lot of power just that can come from switching on an add-on that can help you track a lot of that data. And then in terms of how you're using it, like you said, reporting, dashboarding, some of it can be just looking in those tools that you have in place and just getting used to seeing them daily. My biggest recommendation is looking every day, looking every week, making sure you know what the numbers are. So if someone were to ask you, what is your traffic like last week? You could say, oh, okay, it was actually pretty good last week. We did a certain campaign and we saw that it was effective. This $1 to $5 million range is really where you want to start making sure you could explain, okay, something went good or bad last week, or we sent out an email and we got some traffic from it.
Yeah.
And then that only expands bigger as the company grows beyond that 5 million mark.
Yeah. So you mentioned a couple of tools in the 0 to 1 million mark. I think, did you say Looker and something else?
Yeah, Looker is a great tool for dashboarding and reporting. So that's a great place. It's another, Looker Studio is a free version of the tool. It used to be called Data Studio.
Yeah.
And that's my favorite easy tool for getting data from a lot of data sources all at once.
Okay.
They have a lot of connectors, really easy to pull all your data and visualize right there.
So what, for a smaller Ecomm, what data sources would they be pulling data from? So they'd be pulling data from Google Analytics, maybe from, let's imagine they're a Shopify store. So there might be additional data that's in Shopify that doesn't sit within analytics, or that they're wanting to compare the Shopify data to the analytics data. They might be pulling in from Klaviyo, I guess. Does it do all of that?
Yeah, so there's a ton of connectors. So most of your email tools, your Google Ads, your display tools, really like all of those marketing tools that we're used to seeing, your social media, all of those have connectors into Looker Studio. And if they don't have a connector, there's ways to connect things like Google Sheets. So if you had an export of data that was manual, you can get that into Looker Studio as well to bring everything into one place.
And what's the benefit of doing that versus just looking in Google Analytics or looking in your individual tools, or maybe pulling them into a Google Sheet?
I think the biggest benefit is just seeing everything you want to see in one place. So if you're having to go back and forth, say I want to go look at my Google Analytics data and I see something happened in my Facebook campaign, now I have to go to Facebook to compare it. That just really slows you down between seeing a data point that's interesting and then making a decision, because you'll get kind of lost in like, oh, I don't know what's going on with all these different tools. And putting it all in one dashboard is the most effective way to really see this side by side and say, okay, well, I know the attribution will be slightly different between what Google credits versus, Facebook would credit. So I at least know if I'm looking at it regularly, expect some percentage variance, and you can start making your decisions from there, having it in one place instead of going back and forth and then being confused of, wait, why am I seeing slightly different transactions here?
Sure. Yeah. And then you mentioned using Google Tag Manager at the kind of 1 to 5 million range. That's Google Tag Manager to tag events for Google Analytics specifically, is it?
Yep. Yeah. So that's primarily for tagging for Google Analytics. And this would be, there's a lot of really basic tags that you could set up where you would set a single tag that tracks all of your form events. I know GA4 has some out of the box tracking, but it doesn't always get you every value you want. So, there's opportunity to add a little bit of extra context or even more details into what you're click tracking, or give it names that are more effective for what you actually call things on your site. So that's a great opportunity to start getting some of those things tracked.
So some examples of that would be maybe if you had a quiz that people were filling in, or a form where people gave you kind of extra data about what they were interested in, or what they, filled in kind of forms on your site. What other kind of things would that extra tracking, can you give us some examples of an Ecomm site that's doing that level of tracking and analysis, and how it's useful to them as business?
Yeah. So especially, I think the most basic and important things to track are things like your newsletter signups. If you have calls to action that are taking people to like a webinar link or an event, being able to single out those specific clicks as this is my high value, CTA that I need to know how many people are clicking on this, and then how many people go once they click on it are actually completing the webinar sign up, are signing up to the email subscription, are taking some sort of action. You can start getting more interesting data like a funnel analysis that would say how many people landed on the homepage, then clicked on my CTA, then signed up for my webinar. Mm-hmm. And that is really like giving you a lot more interesting information to help you start enhancing your website of, okay, people are always dropping off at this certain place, or especially with e-commerce, starting to get funnel tracking of why aren't people buying this product? Is there something wrong with how I'm marketing it? That's really where that tracking adds the extra value.
Okay. And then once people get to that 5 to 10 million range and beyond, what's kind of going on there with like the way they're handling and looking at data? Like what's the next level of complexity we're talking about here? Or is there one? Is it necessary to be more complex at that stage or not?
Yeah. Once we get 5 million and beyond, really, that's where I think you start to have a bigger team that's looking at data. You have more people who are involved in the data process. So you kind of have more resources that can dig in and really understand the full story going on in the data. So this is where things like A/B testing come into play, mm-hmm. where you can start to really enhance your website, really make some interesting decisions based on the data that you're seeing with how users engage with different features. You have a development team, including A/B testing as part of the process, makes it really effective to measure how every small change of a feature is either improving or not improving the site performance, and really helps you measure exactly what it is that your users want your website to look like. And that's where I would say, like, once you get beyond 5 million, you can start adding some of that in. Mm-hmm. The other aspect I would probably start to add in this, bigger size of business is qualitative analytics. So this would be your Hotjar, Full Story, Session Stack, any of those Clarity session recording tools, because as you're starting to dig more into things like A/B testing, maybe looking deeper at your e-commerce funnel, you can get pretty far with something like a Google Analytics to understand what's going on. But sometimes you'll hit a point where you can't figure out why. Like, I can see everyone's dropping off at this point. We saw a lot of clicks up to here, but for some reason, no one's going past it. When we try to test it, everything seems fine. But then being able to go watch some sessions, you can find like, oh, a bunch of people are getting a bug we didn't know was there because it didn't happen to us. Mm-hmm. Or we're seeing that people think this thing is a button, but it's an image, and then they're getting frustrated. You can get so much deeper at this point when you start adding that session recording. But I think it really becomes important at this stage when you have more people that can go watch some of those sessions, make sure that the recording tool is being used, when you have that level of focus on your web analytics and marketing in general.
Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah. And I think it's really important too, like, again, the stage and the amount of data flowing through is really key, right? So if you're at the early stage, you're not going to have enough data for a button change on a minor page to make a difference statistically significantly. So there's probably not much point in doing those kind of micro level changes, and it's probably better to take some bigger swings and look at the overall data. Whereas once you get much more traffic, you can start to be more granular in the way that you're testing and analyzing that data. Yeah. Okay. So I'd love to hear some stories of like e-com brands you've worked with and being much closer to the data and putting in place the right data practices has actually changed the outcome of their business.
Yeah. So one of my favorite brands to talk about, because it's so different from most e-commerce brands, they're actually a funeral home website builder. So their primary focus is helping They're kind of, I would say, similar to like a WordPress, where they give funeral homes templates for their websites so that the funeral home can post obituaries, and then also provides a value of being able to buy flowers directly for the person who has passed away straight from that site. So the big benefit there is you don't have to go find a florist nearby to go get flowers to send to the funeral. You can do it right from the obituary website and order that directly from there. They have other products as well. But what's so interesting about this industry is that all of the typical things that work in e-commerce kind of don't work on their websites, because you're targeting people who are in some of the most difficult points of their life, having lost a loved one. And so logic doesn't always apply. The typical usability practices that we see don't always apply. You tend to see a lot older people. So something that might look really cool on an Amazon, or like a new feature that we're seeing that's really popular in the e-commerce space, might be really confusing for this demographic of users. And so A/B testing is huge for this client, because everything has to be measured in order to know, okay, what does this set of users actually like to interact with? And we've done a lot of tests where we try something that's like, okay, the best practice is to put this button maybe on the bottom right of a screen and mobile, because that's usually where people will click. And then we'll find that no one found the button and no one clicked on it. A bunch of people got frustrated. It's really interesting. So having that kind of measurement plan where we can see those minor changes and how people interact is really valuable. And this business, I think, is also really special because their team is super data driven. So data is the core of like every meeting that they have internally. They're always speaking in numbers. And so as an analyst getting to work with this client, it's just so much fun, because we're always talking about like, what's the biggest data challenge? How do we improve? And how do we, meet the needs of this really unique client base? So yeah, that's one of my favorite and most interesting ones, because it's so different from your typical e-commerce.
Yeah. And it just goes to show, like, I think what a lot of conversion rate optimization experts I've spoken to have said to me is there isn't kind of like a best practice one size fits all that's going to definitely work for every website. You can start with first principles, sure, but everything needs to be tested and validated with data. So what you're saying really resonates with that, because you're saying that, like, if they'd applied just the best practice, they would have had a business that would not be doing as well as it is now, because instead what they've done is followed the data and seen that the best practice doesn't work for them. So yeah, that's really insightful. What mistakes do you see e-commerce brands make with data?
Yeah, I think some of the biggest problems come with trying to lead too much with intuition or feeling of what might be good for your business, kind of similar to what we were just talking about, instead of letting the data talk. So you'll always find that there's things that you think are going to happen when you're selling a product, or you think that the funnel is going to work a certain way. So again, oftentimes people or e-commerce businesses will try to copy kind of a Shopify version of checkout. And I see regularly that this, for some reason, works really well for Shopify. And then sometimes when other websites try to create a simplified checkout in the same way, they'll run into issues where they'll see drop off in funnel steps that don't make sense, or, something just kind of goes awry despite following the best practices. And I think really a big thing here is making sure that they have the information tracked, so that if you hit one of those roadblocks of like, I don't understand why this isn't selling the way it's supposed to, or I thought that this product was going to be the most popular product, I thought this new checkout was going to be my like conversion rate savior, and all of a sudden everything's going to be great. Being able to measure what's different with anything new, how a new product might compare to an old product, how people are engaging differently, how people are going to check out from different areas of the site, really will help make sure that you're understanding every part of your business rather than kind of making assumptions based on what you know about your business or what you think about your business. So I think the biggest thing is just making sure that you have a team or you're focused on looking at the data at every step.
So Google stopped supporting UA Analytics, which was the old Universal Analytics version. And now we all must use, if we want to use Google Analytics, we must use GA4. So firstly, how are you feeling about GA4? What are your thoughts on it initially?
Yeah, so I would say every month I have probably a slightly different take on GA4 as I get deeper and deeper into it. I would say maybe a year ago, my thought would have been it's going to be very different from Universal Analytics. And as I get deeper into it, I'm seeing a lot more similarities with things like how I analyze the data, what data I'm pulling regularly to do analysis. But I think there are some really interesting challenges with it as well that I think are really helpful for people to know, because I think the normal process is to go into GA4, see that it's really different, and then panic. But there's ways to make it really work for your business. For example, I really like that the GA4 reports are focused in a library format where you can edit your library. And I think that's an area where a lot of people don't always take full advantage in their GA4 reports. I think the tendency is to go to Looker Studio or just to go to Explorations to pull data, but it's actually pretty nice to have the customized reports in GA4, where Universal Analytics, you may have to do about 20 steps to get to the specific report you like looking at every time you want to go look at it with segments and filters and really diving deep. And I think GA4 really shifts the perspective from I'm going to use this as an ad hoc reporting tool every time I come in and try to go find the report that I need, to a much more dashboarding approach and a much more intentional approach to analyzing your data.
Cool. So for the uninitiated, what do you mean by that with the libraries? So it means you can create a report and then save it so that you can come back to it every time you need it. Is that the gist of it?
Yeah. So now when with Universal Analytics, you would go into the platform and you'd automatically be put into the same set of standard reports. So no matter what business you were looking at, whether it was using free GA or the premium GA, and no matter the size, shape of business, whatever it was, you always saw the same exact set of reports. Now in GA4, instead of coming to like the same default set of reports, you can customize what all of those reports are. So you can create something like a custom exploration and turn it into one of the reports that you see every time you come into the tool. Yeah. So it makes it a lot easier to just find those deeper things that you care about instead of having to shuffle through everything that's available in the tool.
Yeah. So let's talk about that then. If you were an Ecomm brand, let's say you're kind of in that middle range, maybe 1 to 5 million in revenue, what would be the key metrics you'd be tracking and therefore building reports in your Google Analytics library to look at on the regular basis?
Yeah, my top reports to always look at are different versions of your channel reporting. Yeah. So looking at dashboards that show in GA4, you can look at it based on either the user channel, like first user channel, which would say, how did they come to my site the very first time they came to my site? Yeah. How did I acquire them? Or you could also build another dashboard that's really looking at it session based. So this time they came to the site, how did they come to the site? And some of those are somewhat standard in GA4, but I would customize them to make sure the secondary dimensions you can pull in are the ones you care about. So if there's a custom parameter you're tracking, making sure you can pull that into the report. You could also change the visuals to be the dimensions and metrics that you care about. So if your biggest focus is driving revenue, making sure you can see the channels by revenue in that view is really important.
Right.
And then, of course, the full revenue equation. So being able to see sessions, AOV, and conversion rate. Initially, GA4 didn't have AOV and conversion rate. Now AOV is called average purchase revenue and conversion rate is called session conversion rate. So they're in there. So you can find them. I know that was like an initial panic, is that we didn't have them. So
yeah,
getting those pulled into reports so that you can see them all in one place is really helpful too.
Yeah, amazing. So really like answering that question of like, how much traffic did I have this period, like this day or this week or this month? Where did that traffic come from? And then how did that traffic perform in terms of what I care about, which is how much did each buyer spend and what proportion of those visits turned or sessions turned into buyers. So you can there, in a nutshell, you can see whether which channels that, which marketing channels you're running are most effective. Are you generally effective overall? Is your site performing worse or better than it was before? Are you doing a better or worse job at getting people to spend more money on your site? So yeah, I think that's really important. And then what about, say things have gone down, like conversion rate's gone down and your key channel isn't performing as well in terms of conversion rate. What would you then do in terms of Google Analytics to go and investigate that kind of a problem?
Yes. So this is probably the most common problem for e-commerce businesses is either why did conversion rate go down or why isn't it going up as much as I want it to go up?
Yeah.
So I recommend probably the first thing I would do is build a funnel exploration that shows my e-commerce funnel. And then that's actually something that you can add in to your reports and look at a regular basis.
Amazing.
Which is fantastic, so that you can really customize it to your process too. So in Universal Analytics, they had the shopping behavior report and the checkout behavior report that kind of gave you a default checkout process. But if you have a really unique website that has a lot of extra steps you want to check in the funnel, you can really make the funnel specific to how users actually browse your site. And so that's usually where I would start, is comparing my checkout funnel for, whatever period I saw conversion rate go down compared to the previous period, and start understanding where in the funnel did people drop off. Was it that we just stopped seeing traffic because it's maybe a certain time of year and it's seasonality, and then, look at it year over year, or, starting to measure things like if you're seeing a drop off in adds to cart from your product pages, try to understand if something changed with the product. Was it a price change? Was it, do we see a drop off that's related to average order value as well? Or was it just a conversion rate drop? Really starting to measure like where those drops happened. Once you kind of pinpoint in the funnel where things dropped off, you can dive deeper into, okay, they dropped off on my PDP. Were people engaging with it? Did people scroll down all the way to the bottom of the page? What happened and why? That also might be where you pull in something like a full story or a Hotjar and look at some session recordings alongside your GA data.
Yeah.
But a lot of this, really, you can look at a lot within that funnel visualization to start. And then you can kind of build out either ad hoc, or if you're doing this a lot, you can build out some other reports that help you answer those questions directly in GA4 as well.
Yeah. And I think that's the way to approach it, isn't it? Like not opening analytics and going, ooh, what am I going to find out today? And like just kind of mindlessly moving around, but actually going there with some really specific questions that you want to answer, and then figuring out how to build the report that will answer that question. That's certainly how I approach it. So first and foremost, like how much traffic do I have? Where did it come from and how's it performing? And then if anything's not performing, why isn't it performing? And then going to look at the funnel and seeing where people drop off. And, you can compare that to industry averages as well. It's easy to find those by searching online, like what's the typical add to cart rate? What's the typical cart completion rate? And you can compare it to your own benchmarks as well. But data is key, and knowing what to look at is key, isn't it? I don't need to tell you that.
Absolutely.
Cool. So what are the key differences between Google Analytics 4 and Universal Analytics that kind of matter to marketers?
Yeah, so there's a couple fundamental differences that everyone should be aware of. One is in the very base sense how sessions are tracked. So it's using a different data model to capture the session information. So inherently, you will see different counts of sessions. So before Universal Analytics was turned off, if you looked at your data across Universal and GA4, you'll see a slightly different total sessions across the two tools.
Right.
Even if you're using like the same rules to track them. Part of that is that by default, GA4 is using more methods to count a session. There's also an option to turn on a modeling step within your data capture as well. And then that means that Google will model sessions beyond what's actually tracked. So that can be kind of a tricky one that people will get hung up on, is making sure they know if they have the modeled setting turned on or not. If it's just observed, which would mean it's like the actual tracking is causing the sessions.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really where the difference starts. And then how that really impacts marketers comes in with attribution. So the default attribution model in GA4 is data-driven. And that means essentially I like to think of it as Google is trying to give what they think is the most accurate look at attribution based on how users browse through to your website. But it becomes really confusing when we're very used to things like a last non-direct click, or maybe a time decay model, or these other attribution models that give you a really clear sense of, okay, it's linear. Every single one that touched it gets some sort of credit. That's a lot easier to understand than data-driven, which we kind of have this black box of, okay, I know it is getting the credit for this transaction, but I don't really know how we got there. So that's where there's also reports where you can do a model comparison and still look back at things like your last non-direct click, if that's what you're used to seeing in Universal Analytics, to get some sense of how the last non-direct click differs from the data-driven. I definitely prefer the data-driven just from the sense of, I think it really is doing a better job than some of the attribution models from Universal Analytics. But if you decide, like, I hate data-driven, I just want this other model, Google Analytics does give you the option to change what your model is in reports, and then it'll change for all of your reports.
Yeah.
So that's one extra benefit that I think is great to
That's huge.
to help you understand what is going on in your reporting.
Yeah, because we've always had to explain to clients why Google Analytics so severely undercounts, for instance, Facebook advertising.
Yeah.
It's because Facebook advertising tends to be a higher funnel marketing channel. So it's not going to be the thing that drives the final click in the journey necessarily, and therefore it's not getting any of the credit. Whereas with data-driven, in theory, it will get more credit. Although the cynic in me thinks that Google's probably built its tool to be a little kinder to Google ads and a little less kind to Facebook. But you know, we can debate that at another time.
Yeah.
So, okay, what else was I going to ask you? Yeah, I mean, attribution's a huge area. Do you have any kind of advice for brands when thinking about attribution and like how they should be thinking about it these days?
Yeah, I think it depends on your marketing mix. So like you said, when you're using stuff like a Facebook and other social tools, and you have a really broad range of a marketing mix, that's where attribution modeling becomes super important, because you have so many more areas where you could be driving traffic, and you really do want to make sure that they're getting the appropriate credit.
Mm-hmm.
I think looking at model comparison tool in GA4 is helpful to understand how each of the different channels are playing a part in the attribution funnel. So looking at like your first touch attribution and seeing, okay, which are the channels that are driving the most transactions or conversions when I'm just looking at first touch
Mm-hmm.
versus kind of getting further into the funnel, looking at linear and then looking at last touch and starting to make a little bit of a assessment of how are my channels actually getting through the funnel.
Mm-hmm.
That can give you a lot of clarity on what funnel might be the best or what attribution model might be the best for measuring your marketing mix.
Yeah.
As well as just understanding, okay, when I'm looking at this last non-direct click, which the team has decided they want to use, we know that we're going to not have the best attribution in place for something like our Facebook ads. And that might be something where we're just aware of it now because we've taken the time to look at the different attribution models so that no one's like panicking when they start to see that data. I think that's super, super helpful as you have more channels.
Yeah, it's such a tricky thing. Like there's lots of tools out there, Northbeam, Triple Whale, Phosphate. There's a bunch of tools that will do attribution. And none is perfect, but the point is like you can't just rely on platform data and you probably can't just rely on Google Analytics to be the ultimate source of truth. You need to kind of take some kind of middle ground. And I think sometimes these attribution tools do provide a bit of a middle ground so we can see a view that's like completely non-biased. But yeah, then you've got to decide whether you're going to actually trust the attribution tool over and above what you're seeing in platform or in Google Analytics. And if you don't have a hard line on that, then you're just going to end up more confused, I think.
Yes, I think so too.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for coming along to share your knowledge. It was super insightful and hopefully I think made for many of our listeners the whole data question a little bit less scary and a little bit clearer, and hopefully get people excited about diving into Google Analytics 4 and jumping in and building some of those kind of dashboard reports that they can use in a really actionable way. Is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience before we jump off?
Yeah, don't be afraid of GA4. If it feels overwhelming, you always have Looker Studio as a great way to dive into those ad hoc questions. The platform of Looker Studio is the same across any tool. So if it gets overwhelming to look in GA4, that's probably the best place to go.
And where can our listeners follow you and find you for more information and updates about what you're up to?
Yeah, so you can find me at my NimbleGravity website, nimblegravity.com. My LinkedIn is, you can find me at Courtney Lindau Lee. I just got married, so you can probably find me at Courtney Lindau as well. Thank you so much for having me.